let's get started with today's lecture. Now, as I said, today we're going to talk about scientific research, and the stuff that I brought with me today are basically 5 topics. The last 2 are a little shorter than the first 3, but let's see how far we get with that. First of all, I want to talk about how do we actually know stuff. You know, this is sort of now a little bit of a philosophy of social science lecture today. This is the only one that we have along that, but it's nevertheless very important to think things through. How do we know stuff? How do we get to say something sociological about the world? How can we make some intelligent scientific statements compared to just having an intelligent comment? In that context, then we'll talk a little bit about some philosophers in that regard, briefly. And then we'll move on into what is called falsifiability. Now, that's an important principle in all scientific research. It's about how we disprove things. Then we move on into the actual steps of the scientific method before, at the end, I briefly talk about some features of the scientific method and about different types of strategies and kinds of research. Yeah? Okay, so that's sort of what I have planned for today. Let's first talk about how we know stuff. How do we know stuff? Yeah? It's actually not such an easy question to answer. Yeah? And actually there's a whole discipline, it's called epistemology, that's the philosophy of knowledge. Contrast to that, we have methodology, which is sort of the practical ways or the methods to acquire, to gain the knowledge. But there's this thinking behind that. How do we know something? So for example, like watching these documentaries, and then sometimes they make some outlandish claims about this or that, and then I wonder, how do they know that? Yeah. Are they scientific about that? Well, when you think about how we know stuff and the answers to that, some people actually truly say, well, we cannot know anything. The only thing we can do is we can interpret stuff. Everything is subjective in a way, and there's nothing really to it. I'm very skeptical of that school of thought, partly because I think there are lots of things out there where we actually can find evidence for. So I really believe in empirical research and in evidence-driven studies where we actually go out and where we actually find some data or do something else that corroborates our findings. Yeah? Okay, so we can only interpret. Some people say that. Well, the thing that you might be most exposed to so far is knowledge through experts, through authorities, right? There are some dudes with beards standing in front of you and telling you stuff, right? Or in school there was a teacher, or somebody else, or your parents tell you something. And this is how you know stuff. But how do you know that this is actually right? So this is actually not really scientific. So what I like to do is to encourage you thinking about and questioning these kind of things that seem to be so obvious, but in fact they are not really obvious. Just because the government says something, that doesn't need to be that it's right. Just because I'm saying something, that doesn't mean that it's absolutely right. Yeah. Just because you think something is like that is not right either, right? So experts and authorities and traditions, they need to be treated with caution, especially when we want to be more systematic about things, when we want to be scientific in the way we approach things and the way we acquire our knowledge. Okay. What is a third way that you might know so far? Well, you might experience things yourself. Now you have common sense. I had to experience that it's really just not worth getting an umbrella in Ireland. I had a few, the first 2 weeks, I'm new, I'm coming to this country, and I think, yeah, I'm so clever, I have my umbrella with me all the time. That doesn't fly. But that's sort of an experience that I have. Or it could be common sense. But just because you think it's common sense, that still doesn't mean that this is now knowledge. This is your experience of things. But it's not, and that's sort of the contrast that I want to flesh out to, that it's not systematic research. Right? And this is sort of what we try to do at the university. Of course we engage in debate. Of course we have intellectual comments. Yeah, and actually some of my colleagues are very active in that. So when you see they have comments in the Irish Times or where else, they comment on current social affairs, but they do that on the basis of proper knowledge that they have. Yeah? Everybody can say something. Everybody can make a grandiose claim, but that's not necessarily systematic or that's not necessarily scientific. It is scientific when it's backed up through a research strategy, through research techniques, and that's sort of what we talk about later on, through the scientific method. Yeah? So all the stuff that you hear, and in some ways, this lecture is sort of different to the ones that you had before, because before you are exposed to these grandiose thinkers, there's Giddens, there's Marx, there's Durkheim, there's Weber, and all those guys, yeah, and somebody just tells you about them, what they do, and this is sort of the theory that they had. But how do you know that they are right? Yeah. Just because there's a guy, although Matthew is a really nice guy, I like him, just because there's this dude standing in front of you telling you this, you shouldn't take these things for granted. You should always kind of start you thinking, okay, how can I test that? Ultimately, how can I disprove that? So we're going to get to that. That's sort of the idea of falsifiability later on. So systematic research. This is sort of what this is all about. And this is sort of where we as sociologists, sort of where we make the contribution compared to other people that you talk with that just know anything about society. Right? Everybody knows something about society. But our job as sociologists is to be systematic about that and to build that on proper research. Okay, so how do we know stuff? Let's backtrack a little bit and let's talk a little bit about the philosophy of social science. Yeah. So this is the only lecture where we bring these kind of things up. We can take a whole series of lectures about that, but we only have one lecture about that. But nevertheless, let me expose you to a few of those thinkers that are important for the context of how we know stuff. Well, the first one is René Descartes. Yeah. Anybody knows what René Descartes is most famous for? Most famous quote? Who? I think, therefore I am. Excellent. Excellent. That's exactly true. That's what René Descartes, a philosopher, is most famous for. I think, therefore I am. René Descartes is associated, of course the guy did other things too, but he's mostly associated with the idea of what we call deduction. Yeah? Deduction means draw conclusions from stuff, he calls them first principles, from stuff that we already know. Yeah? So here the saying was, or actually René Descartes, he wondered, how can I ever find the truth? Or he was one of those moral philosophers who thought, okay, how can I find the truth in the world? And then he wondered, maybe everything is just an illusion. Yeah? Maybe nothing really exists in this world. And then he wondered, how can I know if something exists or not? Yeah? And then he reasoned, that's the idea of deduction, when I know one thing for sure, then I could draw a conclusion from that thing. So in his case, it is only beings that exist can think. And he observes himself thinking about all that stuff. His conclusion is, I exist because I think. Yeah? But let me backtrack a little bit and show you, this is another example that hopefully is a little clearer. So it's very much about thinking things. So from one thing that you know, driving a conclusion for something next that follows from it. Yeah? That's sort of the idea. So the example that I have here is, for example, let's say I would know that all students are nice. Yeah? Let's just assume this is sort of something that I've figured out. That this is sort of a knowledge, this is a universal truth that we have. Okay, then the principle of deduction would work in the following. If I have something like that, like a universal truth, like all students are nice, and then I observe, and then I have a particular student, it's called Sarah or Mark or whatever, it doesn't really matter, and I see that Sarah or Mark, that he or she is a student, then the conclusion would be that Sarah is nice. Now you see how this goes? I have the first truth, all students are nice, Sarah is a student, ergo Sarah is nice. That's the principle of deduction. basic principle that goes along with that, they're always in tandem. That's the idea of induction. Induction is related with this guy, Francis Bacon. It's not the artist Francis Bacon, it's sort of much, much earlier. And the idea of induction essentially builds on finding observations, looking at stuff, and then generalize from these observations to make general claims. So instead of, when you think back, Descartes or deduction was I have a truth and then I kind of deduce something for a specific case. Induction is I have a specific case and from that I kind of make a generalization to have a universal statement. Yeah? So that's sort of the opposite of that. And Francis Bacon, he emphasized the role of data, or he looked at this deduction idea and realized, okay, this is ridiculous. Yeah? How can you kind of deduce one thing from the other? Maybe you can deduce that I exist because I'm thinking, but from there onwards, what is sort of this universal truth? How do we ever find them to begin with, right? So where are sort of the starting points for these kind of things? So instead, he emphasized the role of data. Look at data and deduce things from our data, from the observations that we have. So, applying the same example of the nice students, right? So now it would work in a different way. Now it would work, okay, the students that I talked with are nice, right? That's something that I have figured out before. Sarah is a student that I have not talked with so far, right? And based on that, so I have other observations, I have other students that I talked with. These are sort of my observations that I made before. And based on them, I make this claim that all students are nice. You see, this is sort of this first step that kind of goes in the reverse with deduction. But induction, I first have the observation. I talk with students, they're all nice. Then I kind of can say, okay, students are nice. Sarah is a student, so that means Sarah is nice. Yeah? So that's this idea of induction. So Francis Bacon, funny story around that. Francis Bacon, he really pushed this idea of experimentation. So for social psychologists, the guy is even much more important than for us. But for us, he's already very important. And he had this idea. He thought about how can we conserve meat. Yeah. So he thought, okay, well, I had this idea. If I put some ice, if I stuff some ice into chicken, yeah, then they're going to last a little longer. That was sort of his theory, so to speak, right? And then he sort of went out and went to test it. Yeah? He did it and kind of basically stuffed lots of chicken with ice, and then later on he compared it with other chicken that he didn't stuff with ice, and then he kind of looked at which ones last for longer. Yeah? So that's sort of a very simple experimentation here, where you actually see how then, based on the observations he has, he tries to make these general claims that by putting ice into something or by cooling something down, it lasts longer. Right? So the funny story around this is while Francis Bacon was doing this, he was in London, he was in a carriage, it was cold, he caught pneumonia, and he died. Yeah. So this can really backfire as well. Yeah. But if you want to remember, René Descartes is the guy with the awesome hair, and Francis Bacon is the guy who died while doing his experimentations. Okay. Now this is deduction and induction. So these are sort of these basic principles that often come back. And in reality, you will see we do something that is in between. Yeah? Because neither the one nor the other is actually how the world really works or how research really works. But it's good to have that in mind. Yeah? So along came another guy, David Hume. Maybe you heard about him before. So he realized, okay, well, science is not perfect. Yeah? So sometimes it's always possible that our claims can be wrong. Instead, he emphasized that we should have a confidence or a probabilistic, we should have a confidence in the probability that our claim is right. Yeah? So it's not that all students are nice, all or nothing. Yeah? But David Hume says, well, the ones that I've talked with so far, right, or there are some that are might not be nice. So basically, he brings in this whole idea of uncertainty that when we do our analysis plays a huge role. Ultimately, when we do tests, when we test hypotheses, we look for this uncertainty, we allow for uncertainty, and we look not at if something is completely wrong, but if it's wrong with a certain probability. That's ultimately what we do. But apply to this little example that I have here, what David Hume would say is, okay, most students I talk with so far are nice. You see, this is not all the students, but most students are nice. You see the difference? Yeah. In the induction case, all of the students that I talked with so far are nice. This is sort of the first observations that is required. And then based on that, when I have another student that I haven't talked with yet, I can induce that this student is nice too. But for David Hume, it would be more, okay, hang on, there's an uncertainty element in it. Yeah? Maybe not everybody I talk with is nice. But most students I talk with so far are nice. And then Sarah is a student I haven't talked with, and then based on that, I'm concluding that Sarah is nice. So these are sort of, in a nutshell, these principles of deduction and induction that are important for the way we think about stuff, yeah, and how we actually derive our knowledge. But in essence, both Francis Bacon and David Hume kind of stress the role of data. We need to have observations for that. And, I very much believe in that as well, that in order to make statements, we need to, or in order to distinguish ourselves from just making an intelligent comment, we need to have data to back that up. You should not say something that you cannot substantiate. That's sort of where the scientific element comes into play. Okay, so induction seems to be the way to go right now, right? We have observations, we collect data, and based on this data, we generalize things. Yeah. Well, if it would be that easy, yeah? Because there are some really important problems with that idea of induction. And the big question is, how can induction ever lead to a universal statement? Why? Well, you're only looking at a certain amount of observations, right? That's the first problem of induction. When you generalize from a limited number of observations. I could talk with all of the students here in the lecture theater, and all of you are nice, but there could be still lots of nasty science students out there. But I haven't talked with them yet. Okay, let me go out and talk with all of them. Then there could be lots of, maybe everybody at UCD is really nice. But those buggers at Trinity, they really suck. Huh? So you see where I'm going with this, and we could go even further and say, okay, let's talk to every student in Ireland, if I would have nothing else to do. And maybe I'd figure out all of them are nice. But then we're just talking about Ireland. So the problem here is, how can we draw a general conclusion from a limited set of observations, even when we have things like representativeness, or we draw a huge sample of the population and so on. Still, yeah, there could be lots of others out there that we still haven't seen yet. Yeah. Okay, so the example, all students I have talked to so far are nice, and therefore all students are nice, but there might be some unfriendly ones out there that I haven't met. The second problem with this idea of induction is that we implicitly assume that this universal statement holds all the time. Yeah? You basically assume that it works in the future as well. That's sort of what David Hume calls the uniformity of nature. And that's a little dodgy as well. Yeah? Because now if I say that all of the students are nice, based on, talking with you guys, I assume that based on what I've seen so far, there could be next year's cohort, the next year's cohort after that, and so on. Maybe they are not nice. So you see, that's sort of the problem. How can I make these universal statements? That's sort of the big question that kept philosophers busy, or philosophers of science or social science busy. How can we make these general statements? Because ultimately, this is what we want to do. Okay, so this is the problem. Along came this idea of falsifiability. Falsifiability. Essentially, falsifiability is this rather ingenious idea by a guy called Karl Popper. Karl Popper, he had this ingenious idea that it's actually impossible to verify something with induction. To say that all students are nice, I cannot verify that by going out there and collecting data and kind of making this general statement based on that. Because of these problems. But what he does say is what we can do for sure, is to show if something is wrong. Right? We cannot show for sure if something is true, or if it holds all the time, but we can show for sure that it does not hold all the time. Yeah? How would that work? Well, I just talked with one student, and the student is just really not nice to me, and that's proof that not all students are nice. So I just need one case to disprove something. While proving something is rather impossible. But disproving something, that's the thing that we can do. And that's this idea of falsifiability. When you read up on that, and have some readings for next week that follow up on that a little bit, of falsifiability, the example that often comes in the literature is the thing about black swans. Right? So how do we know that all swans in the world are white? Well, we cannot really verify that, but what we can do, we can disprove it by finding one swan that's black. Yeah? So that's sort of associated with Popper, often not in the number of size. So you observe a lot of swans. You can go, I don't know, you can go to the zoo in Dublin, or you can go somewhere else, and you see a lot of white swans, and you come back to me and say, Thomas, I've seen now 1,000 swans, and all of them are white. Yeah? And now I'm going to make this claim that all swans are white in the world. I would say, no, I don't believe you. Why? Because there could be lots of other ones out there that you haven't seen yet. But if you come to me and say, Thomas, I found the one swan that is not white, then you disprove that statement that all swans are white. And essentially, that is what Popper says how we acquire knowledge. Not by proving something, but by disproving something. Or actually, in practice, how it goes, we set something up so that it can be potentially disproven. If we have something that cannot be disproven, if there's no way how we could go along and disprove something, that's not a scientific statement. Well, actually, if you show the same thing that others have shown before already, that we don't learn anything. Well, of course, in practice, then there's another case because you never apply it to the same groups and so on. So there's sort of like, we still acquire some knowledge of it. But in the extremes of its form, it says we acquire knowledge by disproving stuff. Another example, if I would say all apples in the world are green. Well, it's one of those statements that I can falsify by just finding one apple that is not green. Right? So that's sort of how this idea of falsifiability goes. It requires you to think, how do you disprove something? And as you will see, some statements are set up in a way that you just cannot disprove them. Yeah? Maybe they're circular, or maybe there's no way of testing something or setting something up. So, strictly speaking, this is not a scientific statement. So, for example, famous theory, Karl Marx. Can I disprove it? How would you disprove it? How would you set it up? So, Karl Popper would say, Karl Marx is not a scientific theory. Okay. So, ultimately, what we want to do, it's not the search for support of a hypothesis or theory, but the title is search for arguments against that, that advances our knowledge. So when you have something, let's say you have a theory that you are interested in, that you want to test, you need to be the advocate to try to disprove it. That's sort of the thing. It doesn't mean that ultimately it turns out to be wrong, right? But your test is set up in such a way that it can potentially be proven wrong. That's the key component here. And that's sort of what defines a scientific statement, that it can possibly be proven wrong. Keep in mind, it doesn't have to be wrong, right? So that means you have a test, it can be wrong, it can be right, and it turns out to be right, yeah? That means your theory still stands. Actually, we didn't learn anything new, but we haven't disproven the theory yet. Yeah? And ultimately, this is sort of how the scientific discipline works. We have such these working models of the world. We have theories, somebody comes along with something. Yeah? I don't know, Newton came along with this idea of gravity, and it stands for a while until somebody disproves it. Right? And then something else comes along, which is now our best version of it. Then along came Einstein with this idea of gravity and so on. Yeah? So now this stands. It doesn't mean we verified it. We can never verify these things. But it's sort of our best attempt at finding something that we haven't disproven yet. So that's sort of like a kind of a different kinds of thinking, you know, when you come along and you come to the university knowledge, like, okay, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, but actually, you know, I'm telling you most of the stuff we don't know, but we just haven't disproven it yet. So then when you look at what science is, a scientific approach towards it, it's the bending over backwards to prove yourself wrong. You know, it's Richard Feynman, it's a famous physicist who looked at these kind of things. Okay, what I brought with me now, let's try this out, how this goes. I brought with me a little exercise. So for 2 minutes, I want you to discuss something with the person sitting next to you. I want you to discuss for 2 minutes whether you think that these two statements are scientific or not. Yeah, and afterwards we're going to talk about it. So what did you guys come up with? The second one is not scientific. Why? It can't be disproved. Somebody else, what did you think about this statement? Yeah? So she says it can't be disproved because we cannot. You cannot prove somebody is immortal. Well, but both people said, both of you said that this is not scientific. Actually, you're right. This is not a scientific statement. Why? What would we have to do in order to show that all human beings are mortal? Yeah. You would have to live forever to see that there's nobody else who hasn't died yet. Yeah. So you can show all humans. You can show that, for example, all human beings are immortal. Yeah? That's a scientific statement, which is so funny, yeah? Because it really messes with your brain. All human beings are immortal, nobody dies. That's a scientific statement. Why? Because I can disprove it. You just need to go to the graveyard of my grandma, you know. And I've disproven it. My grandma died a while ago, yeah? So don't be sad for me. But the reverse of it, all human beings are mortal, cannot be disproven. What about the first statement? Maybe somebody in the first row? Yeah. No. By now, a scientific statement, the way we define it here is it's falsifiable. That's sort of the idea. Yeah? Scientific. So be aware. So don't mix that up in terms of there being a study out there, right? So that kind of means there's evidence for it, yes. But a statement can still be scientific without having done the research about it. Yeah. So what about the first statement? Is that falsifiable? How we would call that? Yeah. Actually, yes. Now it's very straightforward. All students who do the readings do well on the exam. How could I falsify that? Well, I would just have to find one student that did the readings, spent a lot of time on the readings, and just screwed the exam. And this, that doesn't mean I have to find. That doesn't mean that this student exists, right? But in theory, this student could exist, and I could go out and find that student. So that's sort of this idea, but essentially it comes down to falsifiability. And so keep in mind, can I potentially disprove something? And this is sort of how we advance our knowledge. It doesn't have to mean that you have to disprove it, but it means it needs to be set up in such a way. There needs to be one possible way of showing that you can potentially disprove something. But for the second statement, there is no possible way how we could potentially ever disprove that statement. Okay. So let's go back and move then a little forward. So another thing that Karl Popper said, and this is sort of how we advance our knowledge ultimately. You know, as I already said, we have different theories, and this is sort of our best idea of how the world works so far. You know, that's ultimately a theory is an explanation for something, you know, like a wider construct and so on. How we explain a lot of different things on a general level. We have these theories, and then we advance our knowledge by essentially putting theories to battle with each other, on whichever one sort of seems better, that's sort of the one that we then champion and the one that we're in favor, right? Think of the idea of how, I don't know, Newton thought about gravity. It was sort of fine for the longest time, and probably that's kind of the stuff, you know, I don't know, that's how I still learned it, how you calculate certain stuff about gravity and so on. But then another theory comes along that is better at explaining certain things that the other theory didn't. Yeah. So theories go to battle with each other. A few other things, you know, Karl Hempel said that nothing's true force all the time. Scope conditions, don't worry too much about that. You know, there's a huge debate about that. You know, as I said, you can have a whole lecture series on the philosophy of social science. But Karl Hempel is an important guy. Emil Lakatos is an important guy as well. You know, he said when we set something up for an empirical test. Yeah, this is sort of what we want to do with the scientific method eventually. Emil Lakatos says, hang on a moment, be aware that your empirical tests can be fallible. That means maybe your data is wrong, right? Because you did some, I don't know, maybe you collected the data wrong or some other mistakes were made and so on. Yeah? He's just cautious for that. Another philosopher of social science, Thomas Kuhn, you know, he said social science is a process, but let me just jump over that because I want to get to the scientific method. Okay, so what is the scientific method? Scientific method is a systematic process for evaluating claims about empirical observations and organizing conclusions into cumulative knowledge. Essentially, it's really just a straightforward recipe that we have here. You have an idea, a claim, a theory, whatnot. Then you need to operationalize it somehow. Well, we come back to these kind of things, but it means like making a testable hypothesis, something that you can potentially disprove, right? Something that follows from this theory, and you can potentially disprove that. And if you disprove that, then actually it implies that your theory is not right. Yeah? And you see, this is sort of what we can say for sure, that your theory is not right. So this is sort of how we set it up. We operationalize a theory, an idea, or a claim into a testable hypothesis. Then we go out, we collect some data, and we test our hypothesis with that sort of data, and then we derive conclusions and revise our theory. So I have a little example here, like students who do the readings for this course do well on the exam. Let me just run through how this actually looks like for setting up, applying the scientific method to that. First one is we have theory, a claim. Students who do the readings for this course do well on the exam. It's a scientific statement because we can potentially disprove it. Yeah. Okay, then we need to operationalize it somehow. Like make a testable hypothesis out of it that we can potentially refute. So I can say then, okay, well, if I would have information about the time and hours that you guys spend on the readings, and at the end I can collect the data. Actually, I have that data about your exam grade. And then I link them together, and then I would actually, this is sort of how I could see if there is this relationship that my claim suggests. So I need to operationalize it somehow, basically breaking down your theory. Theory is a greater, bigger thing that often explains lots of specific things, and then I kind of break it down to a very specific thing. That's what we call operationalization. Okay, then I test this hypothesis with some sort of data. I go out, collect the data, and look at the correlations. Don't worry too much about what a correlation is. Basically means the one goes up, then the other one goes up. Yeah? And ultimately, I can derive a conclusion, and which means that I can confirm or reject my hypothesis that I specified before. And then based on that, I can revise or build a new theory. Yeah? So this is sort of how it is. How does this work in reality? Well, in reality, it's often kind of the circle that we have. We have a theoretical idea, and we have observations, right? And based on the observations, we generalize from these observations. That's sort of where this induction comes into play. We have the theory, and then based on this theory, we make claims about something else. Remember, theory is now we assume that something is true. It's like René Descartes, I think, therefore I am. We assume that something is true. Only existing beings can think. That's the theory, and then we make a claim about a specific case, which is that René Descartes says, okay, I exist. Yeah? I'm sort of now the observation here from that I deduce from that. And then we look back at the observations. This is sort of when we test our hypothesis, and then we go back up again to make generalizations out of that. So in reality, this is sort of a circle that we go through. I have some more examples about that, but let me jump over that. I want to briefly talk about some features of scientific research. Falsifiability. That's sort of, I hope that kind of you take that out of this class. If you take one thing out of today's lecture, it's falsifiability. This idea that a theory must be stated in a way that it can be disproven. You don't want to verify stuff, you want to disprove stuff. So in order to be scientific, you need to apply the idea of falsifiability. Then we have replicability. We'll come back to these kind of things. That means that others should be able to repeat the research and obtain similar, if not identical results. Precision, that you need to be clear and precise in your definitions. And often this is sort of where it goes wrong, where people are very fuzzy. And that's the sort of where it becomes bad research. Yeah? When people don't adhere to these principles. When they do something that is not replicable, or when they do something that is not precise. Or when the sort of last concept that we have here is called parsimony. Parsimony means that when there are multiple equally good explanations, we should accept the simplest explanation. We should not necessarily make things complicated. If we can explain something in a simple way, and we have an equally good explanation that is much more complex, the simple explanation should be preferred. Now that's this idea of parsimony. But we might come back to that. But falsifiability, that's sort of the key thing. to take out of here. Research strategies, I don't know, probably I'm running into open doors. We can have quantitative approaches, we have qualitative approaches. We'll cover both of them here in the lectures. People used to have strong opinions about that. I think that's just so last century. Nowadays, we don't really have that divide anymore. It really depends on what you want to do, and then apply the best research strategy to answer your question. So that's sort of what I'm trying to teach you. You have a problem, and then think about the best possible way to apply and to answer that question. So just that you heard these things before, different types of research. Research can be exploratory. That means like I scope out a particular phenomenon, or I generate some initial ideas. It can be descriptive. So I'm jumping more into describing something, what, when, where, or it can be explanatory, and that gets more to finding an explanation for why something happens the way it happens. And that's sort of like what we ultimately want to go to. Doesn't mean that the other types of research are useless. I think they are actually required, they are important to get to the explanatory part at the end of the day. You need to have a good description of your phenomena before you actually can jump in and try to find an explanation for that phenomena. But this explanation part, that's sort of what will keep us busy next week. So we'll talk much more about explanations. And the reading for Monday, let me finish on that note. The first one basically recapitulates a little bit what I just talked about, and the priming reading, that's sort of what the lecture will be about. Yeah? Okay. See you guys on Monday.